So we learned yesterday, as a bit of a backtrack, that women were encouraged to join the military. And we had the WAVES, that's the Navy version. We had the WACs, W-A-C, that was the Army version. And then we had the WASP, that would be the Army Air Corps version. But most women showed their patriotic duty by working in factories. The Rosie the Riveter, as it became known. Women were encouraged to work in factories. Women went to work and they worked very hard. Now, my mother graduated in '43 from St. Peter's High School. The next year, my mother went to work for International Shoe here in town. They're about where the old prison should be, that 5 or 6 story building. They made army boots. And I know my mother said that she and her sister Mag walked every day from their home on Clark Avenue, Dunklin Street and Clark Avenue to the factory. They worked their shift. In fact, she said sometimes they worked a shift and a half, and she saw it as her patriotic duty. My mother said she enjoyed working. And I know that my mother was always happiest when she had a job to do. All Americans were asked to do without. Now, my father's father, after he went broke in the Depression, decided to start a funeral vault company. Now, here in the state of Missouri, when you die, obviously you are embalmed and your body goes into a casket. But the state of Missouri says the casket has to go into a cement box, a vault. Well, that's what my grandpa Ebel did. He made cement vaults. Now, my father was in high school, but my father said he did not go to high school very much because he found that working for his father, he could make a whole lot more money. My father said that he could dig graves and make even more money. Now, my father said the hardest part about the vault business was during the war, sometimes instead of getting money, they would get coupons. They would get coupons for gas. They would get coupons for tires. Because they said that was the 2 things they just couldn't get enough of. A lot of times people would come in and they couldn't pay for the vaults, so they would bring in vegetables and things like that. My mother said that once a week they would have a scrap metal drive, and her father would put out scrap metal for the people to pick up. My mother talks about having a big garden in the back of her yard. She said her mother had the big garden for WW1, and she and her sister Mag had the big garden for WW2. The war was incredibly expensive. All wars are expensive. And so they decided to change how we do taxes. Now, originally, in March, you would figure out how much money you had made the previous year and how much money you were to pay the government in taxes. And then that tax bill had to be turned in by the middle of April. Well, what they did in World War I is they said each month we will decide how much money you should pay in taxes, and then we'll take it out of your check. It's called a withholding tax. And that's what they do today. If you listen to President Trump talking 2 nights ago, he said he'd like to lower the withholding tax. You still have to pay the tax. They just won't take as much out of your paycheck, which, well, that's his opinion. People were asked to buy war bonds. I know when my mother and father went to the movies, there was always somebody there to say, would you like to buy a war bond? A lot of the old films, they always end with buy war bonds. The science community is going to step up. Of course, the biggest project that we put in our notes was the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was, let's develop an atomic bomb. But there were other projects. There were projects to make artillery shells more precise. There were projects to make ships faster, make planes go higher, and so on and so forth. Blacks. Blacks were encouraged to join the army. Toward the end of the war, blacks were being drafted. Now, originally, blacks were assigned to what is called quartermaster. Quartermaster are the people who drive the trucks. Quartermaster are the people who unload the ships. Quartermasters are the ones who dig the graves. But as the war went on, more and more black units are turned into combat units. Now, a combat unit would be like this man here, where you're issued a rifle and you attack the enemy. Now, when you are a unit, you come under the supervision of your commander. And if you do pretty good, your unit commander says that your unit should have a citation. And then the flag that your unit has, they tie a ribbon around. And black units won more citations than white units during the war. Now remember, this is still a segregated war. Blacks are going to fight. They're going to have white officers, but they will not have any whites in their units. There was a belief at the beginning of the war that blacks could be a part of the army, but they weren't skilled enough to fly an airplane, although there were over 1,000 commercial pilots already who were black. There was an experiment during the World War II. Black men were picked out of their units and sent to Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. There, they were taught to fly. After they had proved themselves at Tuskegee, they were then sent overseas. And the Tuskegee units shot down more German airplanes than the white units. Now, the Tuskegee Airmen, as they were called, were very proud of their prowess in shooting down airplanes or protecting bombers. And so they decided to show off to the Germans. And the back end of their plane, they painted red. So to other Army Air Corps units, these Tuskegee Airmen became known as Red Tails. Now, Hollywood picked up on this a couple of years ago, and here is a promo for the movie Red Tails.
Bogies inbound, 12 o'clock.
They were young men from across America, fighting a war abroad for a country that did not offer them equality at home. The Tuskegee Airmen fought the enemy while simultaneously fighting racial segregation. Their story is told in the new motion picture Red Tails, directed by Anthony Hemingway.
This story isn't told in curriculums in school. I didn't learn it coming and growing up. And to be able to get their stories from them, you know, and to be able to talk to the living history, it's amazing.
Beverly Dungill, who celebrated the opening of Red Tails with fellow Tuskegee Airmen at a screening in Chicago, is part of that living history. He entered the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, in what was then the segregated South, during the final year of the war.
The time that we endured rampant segregation, rampant discrimination, hate, and the names that they called us and the treatment that they gave us, that we had to endure, you can't describe that.
What we do, how well we do it, does it matter?
The movie shows how Tuskegee Airmen like Virgil Poole Sr. set out to change widely held stereotypes about African Americans.
So there were those skeptics who didn't believe we were going to make it. But I've been told that our pilots became as good as and better than many pilots who had other training that weren't black.
In fact, the Tuskegee Airmen were among one of the most decorated air units of the war, getting hundreds of bombers to their targets and back.
And not only did we love to fly and we loved the combat activity, but we knew that if we were good, the society would change.
But Dr. Roscoe Brown's hope of changing society did not materialize right away.
The reporters didn't care about the black pilots at all, and as a result, they wrote nothing about it.
Has this flight order been verified?
Actor Cuba Gooding Jr. plays an officer in Red Tails. He says the film gives the Tuskegee Airmen the credit they deserve.
They were officers and they were denied access into the officers club, and they finally stood together as brothers in arms and said, you know, we're actually fighting a double war. We're fighting the Germans over the skies of Berlin. We're also fighting the military, and the fact that we die for our country. We need the respects afforded to our counterparts, our Caucasian counterparts. So I think, I think there's something for everybody to learn.
Dr. Roscoe Brown says the film contains an important lesson.
Desegregation is a blot on American history, and we helped to remove that blot by our excellence.
That excellence paved the way for the desegregation of the U.S. military in 1948.
On behalf of the office I hold and a country that honors you, I salute you for the service to the United States of America.
And the Congressional Gold Medal for the Tuskegee Airmen in 2007. King Fairbaugh, VOA News, Chicago, Illinois.
As you heard the gentleman say, discrimination was something they would like to get rid of. Black leaders demanded that President Roosevelt should do more for integration. And one of the concessions Roosevelt talked about was integrating the military. Now, Roosevelt had already begun to integrate the federal government, but black leaders wanted the military to be integrated. 1944 is a presidential election year. Franklin Roosevelt ran for a fourth term. That's President Roosevelt on the right. Now, President Roosevelt went through vice presidents. Every time he ran, he had a new vice president. And the fourth time he ran, he went to Harry Truman, senator from the state of Missouri. Now, Truman had made a name for himself in the Senate by looking at cost overruns. Truman had felt that some of the companies were trying to make too much money during the war. And that's Truman's claim to fame. Well, Truman didn't want the job as vice president, but he accepted it anyway. The Republicans will turn to Thomas Dewey. Thomas Dewey is a prosecutor in New York City. Now, if you are familiar with the mafia, Thomas Dewey was the prosecutor who put a lot of mafioso kingpins in jail in the early 40s and had some of them deported back to Sicily once Sicily became a free and independent country. The red states are Mr. Roosevelt, the blue states are Mr. Dewey. Now, just like the election of 1940, Roosevelt has an easy victory, but if we compare this election to 36, it isn't even close to the number of votes that Roosevelt received. Roosevelt had a custom that in the winter he would leave Washington, D.C., and he would go to Warm Springs, Georgia. They had warm springs that had lots of minerals, and it made him feel better since he had difficulty with his legs. It was down in Warm Springs in April of 1945 that Roosevelt died of a brain hemorrhage. A brain hemorrhage is where a vessel breaks in your brain and you literally bleed to death in your brain. It's a very quick way to go.
reaction among troops was complete. Everywhere there was a silent tribute to the passing of a great leader.
A war casualty as certainly as any soldier killed in battle.
On April 12, 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt is at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia, recuperating from exhausting travels overseas. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, FDR collapses in his living room. By 3:35 p.m., America's longest-serving president is dead.
The world paused in uncertainty for a few moments today when the news was given to the world that President Roosevelt had slept away. News that stunned and suspended in immobility for minutes the whole country, the whole world. Millions of men and women stopped still, unbelieving.
Under ordinary conditions, it would be exceedingly difficult to absorb.
Although rumors of Roosevelt's deteriorating health had persisted for over a year, his sudden death stuns the nation and leaves the fate of the war uncertain.
The greatest casualty of the entire world now suffered by all the people of the world.
It was Truman's custom in the afternoon to go to the U.S. Senate and play cards with some of his friends who were still in the Senate. It was during one of these card games that he was interrupted and told to call the White House. When he called the White House, he was told the president had died. Here is a famous scene in one of the conference rooms of the U.S. Senate. Now, Harry Truman has his hands on the Bible. A federal judge is administering the oath of office. The lady who is in the background, that is Bess Truman. And Bess Truman wrote in her memoirs that her greatest fear when her husband became vice president is that he would become president. She did not like Washington. In fact, she did not stick very often in Washington. She spent most of her time at the family home in Independence, Missouri. If you've never been to the Truman Library, if you've never been to the Truman home, first of all, shame on you. It's easy to get to. I was going to say it's easy to get into. I don't know now with all the virus talk going on if it's still open. But when you get older, you ought to take a chance. With the end of the war, the United States and the Soviet Union came out of the war with the largest armies, the largest navies, the largest air force. The United States and the Soviet Union were declared superpowers. Now, generally, to be a superpower, you have to have the most of, the most men, the most planes, the most ships, blah, blah, blah. Almost all of Europe was in ruins. How is Europe going to recover? Well, that's what the next lesson is all about. When the cost of the war was calculated, over 100 million people died. Now that would be both Allies and Axis. Of the Allies, the Soviet Union had the greatest number of casualties. In fact, you'd almost have to quadruple the American casualties to even come close to the Soviets. This is one of the more famous cemeteries. This is the cemetery you can see off in the distance. You can see the ocean. This is the cemetery for Normandy, D-Day. And these are the young men who paid the ultimate price for the invasion and the battles that took place in Western France. Now, throughout Europe, there are cemeteries, American cemeteries. And not only do the Americans take charge of cutting the grass and making sure everything's fine, but so do the host nations. In all, it is believed that 250,000 American boys died during World War II. Now that would be both in Europe and the Pacific combined. The U.S. Army had the greatest number of casualties. The United States Air Corps had the second number, then the Marines, then the Navy. Several of these young men who died in combat were dug up and brought back to the United States to be buried here at home, but most families chose to allow their loved ones to stay in France or Belgium or Germany or the Philippines or New Guinea or even Okinawa. Now there's some problems with Okinawa. The Japanese have let it be known they'd like for us to take all of our dead away. And so far the United States has said no with a resounding
Almost 6 years to the day after it began, the bloodiest war in history drew to a close. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we're looking at the final days of World War II and how it finally came to an end. World War II officially ended on September 2nd, 1945, but the events that led to the Allied victory were put into motion earlier in the war. A number of important events took place in April and May of 1945 that helped lead to the war's end. In the early years of the war, the Axis successfully advanced throughout Europe, with invasions of countries like France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. However, 1940's Battle of Britain turned the tide and halted German advances through Western Europe. More failed Axis invasions followed, but 1941's attack on Pearl Harbor finally brought the United States into the fight. By 1942, fighting two fronts proved too challenging for the Nazis, and the Axis lost momentum. The Battle of Stalingrad, in particular, proved to be a turning point, where the Allies took full advantage. 1944 saw more Allied victories, such as the June 6th attack of German forces at Normandy, France, that is now called D-Day. By the end of that year, the Axis downfall was imminent. Amid more Allied pushes through Europe, on April 27, 1945, Benito Mussolini was captured while he tried to escape Italy for Switzerland. He was killed the next day, and this directly led to the surrender of the Italian fascist forces. Just a few days later, on April 30th, Adolf Hitler committed suicide while hiding from the bloody Battle of Berlin in a bunker. He did so to avoid being caught and killed like Mussolini. May 1st saw Nazi forces in Italy surrender to the Allies. German forces throughout Europe continued to surrender in the days that followed. And finally, unconditional German surrender was announced on May 8th and 9th, and this was followed by a German ceasefire shortly thereafter. The last holdout of the Axis powers was Japan. Though that country had started out winning most battles, the Allies and the Americans began to triumph more and more. The culmination of the nuclear arms race came in early August 1945, when the Allies, led by the United States, dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in an effort to quickly end the war. The day the second bomb was dropped, the Soviets joined the Pacific fight by invading part of Northeast Asia. These shocking events helped finally put an end to the battle. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered after experiencing tremendous casualties. Finally, the surrender documents were signed September 2nd, 1945. The war was over, and the Allies had claimed victory. Officially, it took until December 13, 1946, for the hostilities to end between the United States and Germany.
Okay, so we are done with lesson 26. Now again, the quiz is on Tuesday. So what are you going to do on Monday? Do you want to study for the quiz on Monday? Do you want to bring in other materials with you to class on Monday? Figure that out. Quizzes on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday we will start on lesson 27. Okay?